consultant in our, okay, a well-respected leader and consultant in our region. And I want to tell you, so briefly, because I want her to have 45 minutes to do her presentation, I want to say these adjectives. So she is a believer, a friend, a mother, a teacher, a principal, an educational consultant, an equity work leader and learner. And I truly thank you, Colleen, with all the things you do, that you're taking time to share your expertise around this voting rights topic, that she worked so hard to do this research for the study group that I was a part of with her over the last year. And she is taking this time to share with us. So thank you so much, Colleen, for joining us. And with that, I'm going to give you the whole screen to go.
Thank you, Teresa, and thank you, everyone. I am humbled and honored that you asked me to be here to present, and share in our evenings together. It's a real honor for me to be here. Voting rights is something that I feel like I've been passionate about. So my very first election was Gore Bush. And so the very first time I was able to vote, I was in college, and there was the big debacle of the pregnant chads and all that stuff. So I really got sucked into what was going on with that election. And so ever since then, it's just been something that I really have paid attention to and tried to learn a little bit more about. When we were asked to pick a topic last year to study and research a little bit more, I jumped on this one, and I was really blown away with what I saw and some of the inequities that happen in our system, and how we are maybe trying to keep our most fundamental right as being American citizens, our right to vote, how we're trying to stifle that for some folks, and how upsetting that was to me. And so as a teacher, I just want to educate as many people as I can about that, so that way they can be informed about what's going on, so we can stand up, like our Bible verses said today, and stand up for justice and do what's right. So thank you. If you have any questions, I was a kindergarten teacher, so I'm used to interruptions. If you need to roll around on the floor, I'm used to that too. So, just don't ask me to blow your nose or tie your shoes. You're all adults. So, but let me know if you have any questions, interrupt. I want this to be about a conversation. So please stop me at any time. This is just a great quote, and so I'm just going to read it out loud because I don't know that I can say it better. This is from Michelle Obama, and it says, "It's more important than ever that we show up to vote, not just this year, but every year, and in every election. Every voice must be heard, and every vote must be counted." And I think it's fundamental to us as Americans that is the case, that every vote is counted, and that we show up and do our civic duty, and that is to vote. No matter which way you vote, that you show up and that you do it. So I think that maybe part of the reason why I kind of talked about Bush Gore in that election was so riveting to me, but I don't remember this being a big thing growing up in my family. My parents didn't go and vote, and it wasn't, a family event. When I was in high school, I did go to Buckeye Girls State, and I was the director of the Board of Elections at Buckeye Girls State in 1998. So maybe that's why I also have a love of elections. But it's really important to me. I have voted in every election that I can since I was 18. I take my kids with me, and it's a part of what I have taught them. My children are freshmen and seventh grader, 14 and 13. So they've been at every election. I went 9 months pregnant to the presidential election in 2008 and had to sit in a chair because the lines were so long, but I'll tell you, I wasn't leaving. I was casting my vote even with swollen ankles, whether my daughter was coming or not. I was going to make sure I voted before she came. So it's just really important that we do exercise our right to vote, and that we protect that right for all of our citizens. So I'm hoping that our outcomes are that we learn or relearn the history of voting in the United States, that we discover the current voter suppression efforts that are taking place, sadly. And I'm going to give you a bunch of resources. So if this is something that piques your interest and you're like, wow, I want to learn more about this, I'm going to provide you those resources so you can go a little deeper in your exploration. And so for the folks that are present in the one room there at the church, I believe, we'll make sure that you get access to this slide deck. All of the resources are embedded in. You can click on all of the links, and that way, if you want, later on, you can go back and share this with your loved ones and family and friends, or do a little more research yourself as well. So this resource document, it's pretty big, and so I'm going to put a link to that in the chat for those of you who are virtual with us. And as you can see here, I'm going to open it up so that way you can take a look. It is a lot. I tend to go overboard in options. I believe that not everybody learns the same. Some folks like videos, some like to read, some like, interactive websites. And so because I train our educators to give options to students, I try to do that as well. So, please take a look. There are lots of videos and documentaries. Some of the Bridge to the Ballot, that was one of them I watched with my kids because I didn't necessarily know the history of that. There's lots of different things that you can take a look at. Why Voting Matters. It's just a short 2-minute clip, but still powerful. So there's lots of resources. They're color coded, so you'll be able to see there's podcasts, there's articles, all sorts of fun things that you can dig into on your own if you would like to. So I really like this quote. It really speaks to me because, this is what we're called to do, to fight and stand up for those that are oppressed. And it is important that we do stand in truth and justice. For those who maybe can't do it themselves, it's important that we recognize our privilege and that we do stand up for, anyone that we can in life. And so this really sticks with me. Someone struggled for the right to vote. So for your right to vote, you have it. Make sure that you use it. And I like this quote because it also means that unfortunately, not everybody has the right to vote. That's been taken away from some people in our country, and how sad that is, and why it's important that we remember what John Lewis said, that this is good trouble, but it's necessary trouble that we need to raise when it comes to talking about our voting rights for all in this country. So now I'm going to turn into a history teacher here, and we're going to go into a little bit of the history of voting rights in our country. So I will also drop into the chat this article link. And so what I did when we had a little more time with our affinity group is we kind of jigsawed this. I'm going to just provide the resource for you, but it's a great article because it really breaks down kind of the timeline. I have a different activity that's a little bit more user-friendly in a virtual format. So we'll go through the timeline just in a different way. But this article is really cool. If you have children or grandchildren and you want to teach them kind of the history and the timeline, it's a great article you could print off and just kind of talk and have those conversations about it with them. But in the beginning of our republic, voting was mainly restricted to property-owning white men, which would later be extended to all men. And while the right to vote was eventually granted to women with the 19th Amendment in 1920, white women were the main beneficiaries. Men and women of color would continue to fight to battle discriminatory voting practices for decades, even after technically receiving the right to vote, culminating in the historic civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, which led to landmark legislation that transformed American voting rights. But today, those voting rights are kind of under attack. And activists and civil rights groups are continuing to fight voting laws that are being enacted even today that are, hopefully what you'll see, are pretty discriminatory. So here is our virtual timeline. So I am going to switch to that, and we're going to walk through some of these things. I hope I'm on the right one here. Oh, and it wants a donation, but not today. I'll get there another day. I'll give you your donation. But here is the timeline kind of where we're at. So this really struck me that in 1866 there was a Civil Rights Act. I thought, wow, that the first Civil Rights Act was in 1866, and I thought that was really interesting. But what happens is with that act of 1866, it granted citizenship, but not the right to vote to all native-born Americans. Interesting. Why would they grant them citizenship but not the right to vote? Makes you think. 1869, the 15th Amendment passes. Congress passes the 15th Amendment, giving African American men the right to vote. But what we know is, did that happen? Very easily. And they ended up fighting for that for a very long time. And even still today, that's something that is still not always freely given. 1896, Louisiana's grandfather clauses. Louisiana passes the grandfather clauses to keep former slaves and their descendants from voting. As a result, the percentage of registered black voters drops from, get this, 44.8% to 4% 4 years later. Mississippi, South Carolina, Alabama, and Virginia follow Louisiana's lead by enacting their own grandfather clauses. So they were given the right to vote, and then it was taken away. Laws were passed that then took away that right to vote for many. 1940, we're going to jump ahead a bit, and there are lots of obstacles to voting. And that's, I think, what you'll see now. Some of the things that are taking place now are those hurdles. We're making it harder and harder for people to be able to vote when it shouldn't be that hard. So 1940, only 3% of eligible African Americans in the South are registered to vote. Jim Crow laws like literacy tests and poll taxes were meant to keep African Americans from voting. 1964, the 24th Amendment is adopted. Poll taxes are outlawed with the adoption of the 24th Amendment. And then there's a lot here you'll see that's happening in the 60s. So this is a time of action that, enough is enough, and we're going to stand up and get that right to vote. By the end of 1965, there were 250,000 new black voters are registered, and 1/3 of them by federal examiners. So they're fighting for that right. They're actually getting registered, and unfortunately that wasn't an easy thing for them to be able to do. In 1970, an extension of the Voting Rights Act is signed. The Voting Rights Act, Nixon said, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 has open participation in the political process. Right, as a teacher, that's what we want. We want our youth and we want our people to be engaged in this process. This isn't just for the rich or only for one color or one gender. This is about all of us in the United States of America having that right to vote. So this is a video that you can check on. This is Barbara Jordan of Houston and Andrew Young of Atlanta. They're the first African Americans elected to Congress from the South since Reconstruction, and this is in the 70s. And there's a video that you could click on and watch. 1975, an extension of the Voting Rights Act is signed by President Gerald Ford. 1982. It's extended again, Voting Rights Act. We're protecting that right. We're going to keep it going. You're going to see here that this changes. The protection and extension of the Voting Rights Act stops. Growing numbers of black elected officials, thanks in part to the VRA. That's the Voting Rights Act. So we're getting more and more participation. It's taken years. This is 1990, but we're slowly growing in our representation. Extension of Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. This is 2006. It's extending it for an additional 25 years, Section 5. So this is where it starts to get a little, Since 2010 alone, the Department of Justice has had 18 Section 5 objections to voting laws in Texas, South Carolina, Georgia, North Carolina, Mississippi, and Louisiana, to name a few. And so this is where something happened. We were protecting that, and then all of a sudden something started changing, and a lot started happening here, and voter suppression is on the rise. A record number of restrictions to voting were introduced nationwide, and again, this is in 2011, and I hope that this has the next chart. Oh, maybe it doesn't. Voting restrictions in Florida, it just keeps happening. There's more legislation about, having voter ID, the claim that there's all sorts of voter fraud that's happening. And what we're seeing is, the question is this another poll tax, the photo ID? Not everyone can afford to get that. In some of the southern states, the BMVs are closed. You can't get there. You have to travel hours and hundreds of miles to get there. Is this a new form of Jim Crow, with the photo IDs? 2011, it's blocked by the Justice Department, but what we know, that was 2011, and some of these things still happened, and there are still laws now currently that are trying to keep people from voting. So this is going to kind of end here. This doesn't go all the way to where we are now, this resource, but it just really kind of shows how it's happened, how the history of voting has happened. The Voting Rights Amendment Act in 2014, a bipartisan group of lawmakers introduces the Voting Rights Amendment Act to repair the damage done by the Shelby decision. Congress can pass a new, flexible, and forward-looking set of protections that work together to guarantee our right to vote. And again, we've made significant gains in voting rights, and discrimination at the polls persists today, and that cannot be dismissed as a relic of the past. We often hear people say, we had a black president, that we're no longer racist, we had a black president. What you see, though, is, when did we start having more voter suppression issues? After we had a black president. And you'll see some charts a little bit later that kind of shows why maybe some of those things are happening, why those efforts are really coming on a little bit stronger. Because our minority voters still face significant obstacles in registering to vote and casting ballots. And so we do need to make sure that we're acting. So here we have a quote from Lyndon B. Johnson, 1965, and this just really rings true. The vote is the most powerful instrument ever devised by man for breaking down injustice and destroying the terrible walls which imprison men because they are different from other men. It's our fundamental right to be able to vote in this country, and it should not be taken away from anyone. And now I want to kind of go into some of the things that are being done to suppress people's right to vote, and I'm not sure why there isn't more of an outrage about this, because it's something that really boils my blood, that we would keep people from voting and making it so hard. But let's talk about some of those things. So here we have some data, and this is going to hopefully kind of sink in some of the things that I was saying. We saw that kind of timeline, and what happened with Shelby and why did that happen? So I want you to look at this data that we have here up on the screen, and this is taken from the United States Election Project. It's a research group. And what are you noticing about that data? The blue line is non-Hispanic white. The red line is non-Hispanic black. The green line is Hispanic, and the purple line is other. What do you notice here?
Turnout among blacks is eclipsing the turnout among whites.
That's right. That's right. And so when did Shelby take place? When did we say that they started having, talking about voter fraud and changing, adding all those voter, I'll say suppression laws? 2010, 2011?
When we had a
So
black president.
that's right. That's right. And when the turnout. And so we kind of tried to reel that in maybe a little bit with some of those laws. What you'll see next is this is the age, and you'll see that this has been pretty consistent. Our folks that turn out to vote, and I will tell you, I am a poll worker, and so I was able to see this in full effect. We didn't have a ton of young people come out and vote, and because I vote in every election and I'm a poll worker, the people who always come out are our older friends are coming out to vote. 60 plus, they're the ones that are coming out and always voting. But so we see that trend has been pretty consistent. It still is, our younger folks aren't voting, but what you do notice is we do have higher turnouts in presidential elections. And we know it's important that we vote for all in all elections. Here's education. Again, the higher education you have, the more likely you are to vote. And so that is kind of upsetting to me too, because it shouldn't matter if you have a college degree or not, that this is our fundamental right, and everyone should value it and find importance in it. And now this is the thing that this is the chart that really made me thinking, maybe why some people were afraid of their power being taken away with some of those charts. So let's just kind of take a look at this for a second. So the non-Hispanic white share of the electorate is going down, right? So how can a lot of times people in power struggle to keep that power. They want to keep that power. And so because they're in power, they can influence what's going on to stay in power. And that's kind of the injustice that we need to make sure that we're talking about. Since 2016, over 17 million voters have been purged from the voting lists. This is nationwide. And if you watch some of those documentaries, you'll see that that's kind of upsetting, and that a lot of people are losing they're being purged off the voting list. And why is that? Because you haven't voted in 5 years or 4 years or 2 years. They keep lowering that. But if they still are residents, why are we taking them off? Why do they have to go back and re-register to vote? That should just be once you register, and you should be able to show up and vote, cast your vote. This is a documentary that came out last year. It's really great. It talks about Stacey Abrams in Georgia, and what we know that she really is an activist and fighting for that justice in her state of Georgia. And we know what happened there because she was educating and empowering and fighting for the right to vote for everyone in her state. And so it's just a few minutes, but that's also something that I want to encourage you to maybe take a look at. And now that was a year ago, you could watch the whole documentary. It was really quite interesting to put your shoes in someone else's, to put your feet in someone else's shoes, and really understand that we make it very hard. Early voting, you stand in lines for days and then they just cancel it. We ran out, you don't get a full ballot, you have an absentee ballot. This documentary really opened my eyes to something because I just show up and vote on election day. I'm not questioned. I I'm able to take that time off work and I'm not penalized. When we think about the suppression efforts of people who can't afford to take off work, should our election day be a national holiday? Should it be that everyone should be able to be off and vote? Do we keep it only for the privileged to be able to do so, to exercise their rights? There's a lot of things that we need to be thinking about as a nation and as people who are called to fight for justice. So some forms of suppression, voter ID laws, purging voter rolls, changing the requirements at the last minute. Since I was working at the last election, there were a lot of things that, people would show up because of COVID. They have with our voter ID laws in Ohio, their voter IDs were expired, their driver's license were expired. So there were a lot of changes that we as poll workers had to accept. But there was a lot of if I got married and because of COVID, things were shut down, what we were allowed to accept and what we had to turn people away from. Why would we have to turn people away who live here and are citizens here and are registered to vote? They were registered, they're in the system and registered to vote, but because they didn't have the proper paperwork because they got married, we had to turn them away or have them fill out an absentee ballot that wasn't going to count because they didn't have the right ID. So it's things like that when you really see that it's happening is disheartening. Limited early voting, gerrymandering, underfunded election day resources. When you look at some of the disparities in our inner cities, they have less voting machines. And in where I live, we had plenty. And being a poll worker, there were maybe 2 or 3 in use at all times. We didn't need 12. Why in the inner city do they only have 3 or 4 when in my rural community we had 12? Again, look at those disparities. And then felon disenfranchisement. If you are a felon, you've done your time, you come out of jail, but you still can't vote. Is that really, as Christians, what we should stand for or support? And I just wanted to give you some updates. House Bill 387 here in Ohio is trying to add more voter suppression. They want to remove the ballot boxes that, because of COVID, we had so much absentee voting for health reasons, for safety reasons for people, that's a personal decision that they should be allowed to have. But they're trying to say that you can't turn it in at the Board of Elections on election day, that they have to be in the mail so many days beforehand. So there's just a lot of hoops that we're trying to get people to jump through to be able to vote, and I just don't think that that's right. For instance, about 5.9 million Ohioans voted in 2020, and this is talking about voter fraud. And out of those 5.9 million Ohioans in 2020, only 13 people illegally cast a ballot. 13 out of 5.9 million. So voter fraud, while it's, a hot topic and while it's in the news and flashy, it really, when we do the research, it maybe isn't as valid or real as what some people may say or think. So just over 100 people illegally registered to vote. So out of the 5.9 million Ohioans that voted, 13 illegally cast a ballot, and only 100 people illegally registered to vote. So some, and LaRose said, and some of those cases involve just honest mistakes. I'll tell you, I had one of my former students come in and he didn't register to vote, but he voted absentee. We knew it wasn't going to count because he wasn't a registered voter, but he was 18. So, is that voter fraud because he voted even though he wasn't registered? He's 18, It was COVID. Did he maybe not know? So is that counted as one of the voter fraud? While voter fraud is rare, some people think that it is a widespread existence, but really it's not. But we have 63% of maybe people in our country think that it is a big deal. But to me, 13 out of 5.9, that maybe isn't as big of a deal as what some folks think. So remember, there's no evidence of systematic voter fraud in the United States. Rare instances of fraud arise. They do occur. But those cases are extremely small and rare, and a small number of the total votes cast. I love this quote by Bernie Sanders. Whether you're a fan of Bernie or not, I think that this is, real and true. And so we need to be thinking and open to, all sides of the story. And this is talking about voter suppression today is alive and well in the form of unnecessary voter ID laws, restrictions on registering to vote, improper purging of voter rolls, felon disenfranchisement, and a staggering array of deceptive practices that are preventing eligible voters from participating in the political process. As a poll worker, you are allowed to bring certain things and certain documentation to prove that you live where you say that you live, just to get an absentee ballot that may or may not be thrown out if that isn't the case. And it's not always clear what is acceptable and what's not. And that to me is, clear as kind. We should just have it out there. If this is what you need to vote, this is what you need to bring, and we shouldn't make people jump through hoops or wait in line and then tell them, sorry, that's not what you need. That's unfair and unfortunate, and it happens quite often. So what can we do? Those are all things that, like, boy, oh boy, they stink, but what can we do as a collective, as individuals, to help? And I just have a little list here. So first, you're doing it. You're getting educated about what's happening. So yay for you. And I hope that you kind of take this and that you've listened and, thought, okay, how can I take this out and share with other people and my loved ones? Make a plan. What is your plan for voting? What is your plan for helping? And kind of educate those in your family for what they need to do to make sure that they have the right to vote. Be prepared when you're going to elections. Here in Ohio, we do have the voter ID law. You do have to have your ID with you. So make sure that you show up with what you need. If you move, make sure you do re-register and make sure that you're registered in the correct precinct. If you're not, you can show up on the day of, but it's going to be, you have to know the process. You may get a provisional ballot. If you get a provisional ballot, you have 3 days to go back and make sure that you fill out that it counted. You've got to do that work, otherwise your vote might not be counted. So it is about being educated ourselves. Make sure you vote in every election, not just those presidential elections. The small ones count. Our local officials matter to what's happening here locally, and so we need to make sure that we're voting. And consider volunteering. Poll workers, there was a small pool of us, and it is necessary. Our poll workers and volunteers, a lot are our senior citizens, and because of COVID, they weren't able to, because of the health risks associated, come out and work the polls. So, if you're healthy and you can, consider volunteering. It was a lot of fun, and it makes you be proud to be an American, to be a part of that process and help others exercise their right to vote. Here's another way you can get people to register to vote. This is so sad to me that we have so few folks registered to vote. And if you look at Ohio, we're way down here. So we really do need to educate our young people, our middle-aged people, our educated people, our non-educated people, people of all colors, genders, creeds, whatever, to get out there to vote, because it is our essential, fundamental right to be able to do so in this country. I love this quote by John Lewis: "The vote is precious, it's almost sacred. It's the most powerful, nonviolent tool we have in a democratic society, and we've got to use it." Woo, chills. So I have this activity that we did as a team, but to honor our time, we won't necessarily do this, but I do encourage you to really find what speaks to you in this. Whether you're a little skeptical or not, whether you do a little bit more digging into it, really be thoughtful. What would it be like if you were a single mom who is living in poverty and doesn't have a car, and you can't get to the BMV because you're working and you can't miss your job because you'd lose your job, but you need to have a voter ID to be able to vote, to make the world a better place for your kids. And there are lots of obstacles and barriers for you to be able to do that fundamental right that we all should be able to do. So even if it's not something that you experience, really try to be thoughtful of what that would be like if you were in a different circumstance in your life. And this is, again, just a really kind of a warning. Turn on to politics, or politics will turn on you. I think this is one of those things that a lot of people avoid politics, and especially right now, because unfortunately our country is so divisive and angry about, this side and kind of battling and fighting. But we need to be educated on what our rights are and about the processes, because what's going to happen is we're going to keep turning on each other, and politics is just going to make it so we've got more and more and more to fight about. And really, that's not what we should be about. We should be about loving and supporting and cheering one another on, and supporting one another, because that's what we're called to do, to love one another as we would want to be loved, golden rule, right? And so it's important that we do understand how politics can impact that, and make sure that we have fair and equitable access for all. So your vote is your voice. So make sure that you use it and encourage your children and grandchildren and loved ones and neighbors and friends to use their right to vote, and to maybe get involved to help ensure that everyone has their right to vote. And thank you so much. Again, this was such an honor to be here with you all. And if you have any questions, or you want some information, or want to know how to get involved, I am not an expert at all, but I'm happy to kind of go on this journey with you and see how we can be who we are called to be together, to make sure that everyone here in this country has a right to vote. So thank you.
Let's thank Colleen for her wonderful. I am going to stop the recording so that we can